Good morning, everybody. It's Murdoch McAllister here. Welcome to this week's Oceans and Fisheries Quantitative Seminar. And before we get started, I have to read out the land acknowledgement. So it starts like this. We would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So that's the land acknowledgement. I'll give a brief introduction to Rob Bison, our speaker this morning. Rob's a senior fisheries stock assessment biologist with the BC Ministry of Environment. He's stationed in Kamloops. He provides assessment and management advice for a variety of fish, pretty spectacular fish species. Provides assessments of habitat and fishery management plans and issues associated. So Rob's responsible for assessing quite a wide variety of fish populations, including Thompson and Chilcotin River steelhead, Fraser River white sturgeon, rainbow trout, wild rainbow trout stocks, and lakeshore populations. And Rob uses a variety of modern quantitative assessment techniques for these, and has been involved in radio tracking programs and tagging data analysis. He's developed, implemented, and supervised the steelhead, bull trout, and lake char management components of his interior regional fisheries program. And he's regularly partnered with other agencies, academics, including people at UBC, consultants and public groups. And Rob's really industrious. He's published over 60 assessment, research, and management reports since the late 1980s. And so with that, I'll put it over to Rob.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity and the introduction. This is going to be about the decline of interior Fraser steelhead. And I've broken down the presentation into 4 parts. The first is exploring factors that may be responsible for the decline. The second is examining how fishing mortality has been managed. The third is to briefly describe where in the life history the recovery potential exists, and to finish off with some summary points. This is an interior Fraser steelhead close-up. This happens to be a Thompson River steelhead. They're valued by some of the First Nation communities in the interior rivers, in the Fraser River upstream of Hell's Gate, in the Chilcotin River, and in the Thompson River. They are valued for a small supply of fresh winter food. And they are also valued a little bit for some particular fishing techniques that are employed by one band in particular. But they are more famously known for being a sport fish. The Thompson River steelhead fishery in particular is a well-known, it has an international reputation. It's highly valued by anglers in the province, and attracts people from beyond the province and all over the world. It's now closed though, because for conservation reasons. So we've observed about 3 or 4 decades of general decline. Now, interior Fraser steelhead is a group of steelhead that migrate in the fall. They have to migrate in the fall to get into the interior, to get through the Fraser Canyon, and to get past the Coast Mountain Range, basically. The only times flow and temperature allows that is in the fall. They cannot do it in the spring, so they migrate all together. There's about 10 populations in total. 6 of those are represented by the 2 groups illustrated on the slide. The Thompson is a group of 4 populations, or spatially discrete spawning and rearing areas. Think about them as populations. And the Chilcotin, 2 populations. The Thompson and Chilcotin, by name, were designated as DUs recently, designatable units by COSEWIC. And so these two plots account for 6 out of the 10 populations of interior Fraser steelhead. The other 4 are tributaries, watersheds that enter the Fraser are around the community of Lillooet, so that's the Bridge River and the Seton River. The Stein River that enters near the community of Lytton, and the Nahatlatch River that enters the Fraser around Boston Bar. But there are no long time series data available for those 4. So, but the majority of the 6 are represented by these 2 plots, 4 for the Thompson, 2 for the Chilcotin. And this is the pre-fishery abundance declining gradually over time with considerable variability, but gradually declining from for the Thompson from some mid thousands down recently now to about a couple of hundred, and Chilcotin from low thousands down to less than 100. And while this has been happening, we've observed that there's been a decline in body size, which would suggest a decline in per capita fecundity, and which in itself is a bit of a concern, because the reason steelhead go to sea is to gain a fecundity advantage. That's a fecundity advantage against their conspecifics and the alternative life histories they live with, and they live and that surround them spatially. So the body size decline is has been best detected by the change in maximum body size. So in the 1970s up to about the mid 80s, the biggest steelhead that you would find, it was typically 30, 31, 32, using 32 pounds, using fisherman language, 30, 31, 32 pounds, and that has since declined, whereas the biggest fish that you see now are in the 21 to 22 pound size class. That change in size is not an artifact of shifting age composition. This age composition has remained stable. It's a decline in growth rate during the part of their life where they grow the most, which is the ocean part of their life. So it's conceivable that maybe that decline in fecundity could explain some or all of the decline in productivity and abundance that we've observed. But if we correct for fecundity and we standardize for density and we plot a measure of productivity, the recruits per spawners at near zero stock size, we see that in the 70s, when the steelhead were big, that that each spawner would produce in the order of 10 or so adult offspring. This is part of the plot, and that has gradually declined, where now they most recently failed to produce even one. So the point here is that even if we correct for fecundity, we still see a decline in overall survival over time. So that would suggest that there's other factors at play other than whatever's giving rise to this decline in growth and decline in fecundity, decline in ocean growth and decline in fecundity. And all the while this has been going on, the juvenile abundance, we have evidence here that juvenile abundance has not declined. So this is from the Thompson, steelhead bearing waters of the Thompson watershed, where over an informative contrasting range of steelhead spawners, recall on the first slide, this Thompson DU was declined from mid thousands to about 200. Here we have a fairly good representation of that contrast in steelhead spawners, and you can see that there is a dependency on in the fry population given how many spawners there were. But by the time, and the fry are about a half a year old when the populations are estimated, but by the time they're a year older, at about 1.5 years of age, there's basically no dependency on how many steelhead spawners there are. Okay. This is not surprising to those that work on the species, because the species is known to be able to fill up freshwater habitat during its juvenile life pretty effectively. They migrant populations, whether they go to sea or whether they go to a big lake, they tend to reside in streams in juveniles for a period of time, presumably to avoid predation in mixed species environments like a large lake or in the ocean. So they typically rear for a couple of years. In the southern part of the steelhead range, smolt age is often 2 or 3 years, and smolt age is a little larger as you go north. And smolting is really dictated by body size rather than age. But at any rate, here is an example of how Girard rainbow trout in Kootenay Lake fill up the habitat by the time they're about 1.5 years of age, and that over a broad range of egg depositions that the association is really quite flat. And of course, when egg deposition has to get really low before there is a response, a strong response in survival, which keeps the juvenile population stable. Here's an example from the Keogh River, a steelhead population on the northern tip of Vancouver Island, where, and this is not these are not 1.5-year-olds, these are actually smolts. So these will be comprised of 2- and 3-year-old juveniles that are migrating to sea. And over a broad range of egg depositions, we see that there isn't a strong dependency. And we see the typical increase once densities get very, very, very low. An interesting sort of side note about the consistency of producing smolts is that these plots here are for a period of time when marine survival was low. When marine survival was high, this population produced in the order, on average, in the order of about 6,000 smolts, and now it's producing on the average of 2,000 smolts. We've since learned that this decline in smolt output, which may on face value be interpreted as a freshwater effect, actually has its origin in decline in marine survival. So the way this played out is that marine survival declined, which is lower plot. The spawners declined over time. And what happened was that it so happened on the Keogh River that the best quality habitats were located in the lower reaches, not in the upper reaches. So the fish have a pretty acute ability to home, or and basically when abundance went down, they spawned in the lower reaches, not throughout the watershed, not the upper reaches. This created a difficulty for young of the year to disperse and use the upper parts of the watershed. So effectively, what ended up happening is we ended up having a reduction in the freshwater range of occupancy, the freshwater habitat occupancy that originated from a decline in marine survival. Okay. So getting into what may have caused the decline, there's some evidence to help on before listing some hypotheses. There's some evidence that help to inform what hypotheses might be considered. First of all, the decline does not appear to be related to freshwater habitat factors. This is probably most simply described by the fact that the Chilcotin and the Thompson contrast greatly in terms of their freshwater habitat conditions, both naturally and both in terms of habitat degradation. The Chilcotin, as Chilcotin steelhead live in big rivers that are not subjected to low flows by any means, and the habitat over this time frame has remained very pristine for this species. Whereas in the Thompson, it's completely different habitat. A lot of it is in desert or interior Douglas fir type regions. There are low flows do occur. There are patches of the steelhead bearing areas that have been degraded by agriculture and by forestry, yet the status is the same. We also have studies looking at the relationship of juvenile recruitment given spawner abundance, and we've yet to note there's no evidence in the juvenile recruitment data of anything obvious with respect to droughts. Studies that have been done in the Thompson. The decline in steelhead beyond just Thompson Chilcotin, in generally, the decline appears to have a geographical pattern along the coast. Okay, so in 2017, researchers in Washington showed that that when they studied the Washington coast, Oregon coast, Washington coast, Lower Columbia, Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound extending into Johnson Strait, that smolt to adult survival clustered into 4 groups. And the decline in smolt to adult survival is most evident in the Lower Columbia and Puget Sound, and not very evident at all in the more open waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Washington and Oregon coast. So that decline has been more evident in the more inland areas, more in the inland seas in particular. They also reported that there is, with the spatial synchrony, that it indicates that there's some important processes occurring either early in marine life or close to shore. Okay. Third line of evidence: the decline in steelhead and salmon, considering steelhead and salmon together, has been more prevalent in the non-ocean type populations than in the ocean type. I think this has been well observed, and things like pinks and chums and ocean type chinooks have fared better than populations like steelhead, coho, stream type chinook, and we can even include sockeye. This the 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 lake and stream type salmon and steelhead species. Decline has been coincidental with decline in body size, which I showed. Decline has also been coincidental with decline in fishing mortality, which I will show shortly. And the decline has been more dramatic in interior Fraser River summer and coastal winter run steelhead than in coastal summer runs. This is kind of interesting. Here on the left, we have the interior summers, the Thompson and Chilcotin with the pre-fishery abundance, the reconstructed pre-fishery abundance in the background, and the spawner abundance in the foreground. You can see the decline in coastal. Here, these are good representations of what we've observed more widely in South Coast winter run populations, is fairly dramatic declines to very low levels, but not in sync time wise. Like they happened at different times. But by contrast, the South Coast summer runs have fared much better. Been holding up much better. The Coquihalla has had recent low abundances lately because there has been a change to the waterfall that they have to ascend in order to get to their holding habitats as adults, and so this is the result of that. But generally speaking, the summer runs have held up better, and we think we know why this might be, and there there seems to be three factors that might explain this. One is that these early timed summer run populations, they have to they migrate early in the calendar year, like in summer in June, before a lot of the salmon populations are convening up on the coast, and they ascend up into above waterfalls into hard bedrock um, environments that are a little steeper in gradient. So they tend to be a little bit more immune to low flow problems because of the steepness of the habitat. They're a little more immune to sedimentation because of the nature of the habitat as well. And they're also they make themselves less vulnerable to predation, marine mammal predation. We think this might be the reason, but why we're seeing this difference. But I'll just leave it at that for now. Hypothetical factors considered to have good prior reasons for expecting a potential effect on recovery. The ones that we've explored so far are, given the evidence, this is what we've examined. We've examined predation by pinnipeds on returning adults, predation by harbor seals, specifically on outmigrating smolts. We've looked at competition with salmon in the ocean, and we've looked at ocean conditions. We've also included hypotheses for freshwater factors, specifically low summer flow and high winter flow, even though we didn't have as good a reason of including these, given the evidence, as we had including these other hypothetical factors. So when we do a conventional stock recruit analysis, say for the Thompson DU, where we have a base model without a covariate here, and we have all these alternative models that include single covariates, the result, these are rank ordered in terms of their AIC scores. And what we find for the Thompson is that the hypothesis that predation predation has been an important driver is strong for adult predation, moderate for smolt predation. Salmon competition classified as weak by AIC standards, but still including these covariates, salmon competition or a combination of salmon competition and offshore conditions represented in our maximum weight time series, fared better than the base, just a straight statistical relationship between recruits and spawners. And then models that predicted more poorly were those that included the ocean condition covariate by itself, and these three variations on freshwater conditions. So covariate for summer low flow affecting fry lagged so that it affected fry. summer low flow affecting par, lagged by an additional year, and freshwater conditions of winter high flow affecting fry. Okay, so these performed more poorly than there was less support than even the standard simple base statistical model. For the Chilcotin, we basically get the same result where the predation hypotheses had the strongest support, followed by salmon competition, or in this case here, the combination of salmon competition and offshore conditions. The base model, sort of intermediate in terms of rank order, and then followed pretty much the same as the Thompson, followed by freshwater conditions and ocean conditions on its own. Okay. This our results correspond with results from researchers from Washington State who recently analyzed or explored covariates for patterns in smolt to adult survival. So their analysis is a little different in that it focused on smolt to adult survival, whereas ours was total survival, total recruits relative to spawners. But it's already pretty well established that a lot of the driving factors here in steelhead patterns are smolt to adult survival oriented anyway. So they focused their study in on that, and their finding was that the strongest predictor in what they explored was that seal abundance, showing a strong negative relationship with steelhead marine survival. Okay. These are the covariate data that were used for the predation models. The census data in the points, the fitted abundance estimates for harbor seals in the orange, and then estimates of pinniped abundance expressed as seal equivalents by adding the sea lions to the measure, but expressed as total seal equivalents. In terms of predation, basically, we know that the harbor seals are predators of both smolts and adults, smolts going to sea and adults, where the total seal equivalents, including the harbor seals and sea lions, are predators on the adults that return back. We know that just from our field experience that pinnipeds have become more prevalent in rivers. Here is some data that from DFO Georgia Strait Stock Assessment from the Cowichan River, showing how busy it's been in the Cowichan River as far as pinnipeds. They've started to formally collect this data over the past 3 years now, because it was becoming more and more evident that there was just more and more presence. So here we have the chum run coming in thousands of fish per day. And we can see the number of upstream bound pinnipeds that are detected. This is with Didson as following the chum run and continuing on. The Cowichan winter run steelhead will start arriving here soon, and there'll be some seals present here to detect those steelhead coming in. We suspect that one of the major reasons why one of our most recent dramatic declines on the coast is one of the winter run populations that was one of the best steelhead fisheries in the province for many, many, many years, and it's declined to where a snorkel survey would yield like a 0 result or a single-digit number. This dramatic decline, we suspect, most strongly is related to pinniped predation. As far as predation on adults is concerned, one of the an observation from the lower Fraser River test fisheries. First of all, they become more problematic in test fisheries in general, but the test fishermen report, and I've observed directly, how they can be, if given the opportunity, they can be very species selective. So this is from the Lower River chum salmon test fishery in the Lower Fraser River, and in a set. In this particular set, for example, the catch was in the order of 100 or 150 chums, and there were 2 steelhead that we managed to retrieve in the net that weren't extracted. And of all the fish that were caught, the only ones that the harbor seals tried to extract and kill and extract were the steelhead. As far as juveniles go, recently in 2017, Thomas and Nelson and others published their findings that uh, uh, analysis of of scat samples of harbor seals in and around Georgia Strait um, uh, uh, suggested that they tended to focus on the salmon populations that produce the bigger body size smolts. Uh, Steelhead and anadromous cutthroat, for that matter, are actually the biggest smolts, bigger than even some of the ones that were reported on, like coho, stream-type chinook, and sockeye. There were also steelhead detected. They are the biggest of the smolts if you include them all with the salmon. Being 2 or 3 years of age. Oftentimes they happen in body size, they happen to be very close to the size of the harbor seal, the predominant prey of harbor seal, which is herring and hake. They may be particularly vulnerable because, and there's some evidence for this in the findings of this study, in that in May, when a lot of the smolt in 2 years were reported on, and in May, in one of those 2 years, of all the salmon that were consumed in the month of May, which is a month where a lot of smolts go to sea, that half of the consumption in one of the 2 years was comprised of steelhead. So that was a kind of a startling finding for us working on steelhead, because knowing how many smolts go to sea of all the other species, to have half in the month of May be comprised of steelhead was hugely disproportionately high. So we pursued this a little further and asked, well, if you combine the 2 years of study together and we're able to offer up a consumption estimate of steelhead smolts per year based on the data in the study, the results, it's a rough calculation, obviously, but the results suggested something in the order of 360,000 steelhead smolts per year being consumed by harbor seals. So that prompted us to try to estimate how many smolts might be going in. We took a couple of approaches that yielded consistent results for the wild smolt input, which is the lower plot here, in and around the years that the study reported. The study was in 2012 and 2013. And then we added the hatchery smolt input from the relatively few number of streams where hatchery steelhead were being stocked. And the total inputs that we estimated was something in the order of 500,000 inputs, suggesting that the consumption might be something in the order of 74%, or at least some majority of what was going in was being consumed, just based on these rough calculations. Now, the interesting thing is that this corresponds very well with some prior tagging studies conducted some years earlier in the 2000s, where steelhead smolts tagged with acoustic tags released from the interior Fraser and from the Squamish-Cheakamus system, so entering down the Fraser and entering down the Squamish into Howe Sound. So we had a consistent result over years and between stocks of something in the order of 70% being lost. And at the time that these studies were being conducted, it was known and detected that steels were responsible for some of this. And that amount of mortality, about 70% that we detected, that happens in about a 1 to 4 week time frame. It takes between 1 and 4 weeks for steelhead smolts to migrate through Georgia Strait and exit either through Juan de Fuca or Queen Charlotte Sound. If they take the shorter route through Juan de Fuca, it's a little more than a week, and if they take the longer route, it's more on the order of 4 weeks, and amounting to about a 70% loss in smolts. In a similar study conducted around the same time in Puget Sound, they had similar results, about 80% mortality in about the 2 to 3 week period that Puget Sound smolts require to migrate through Puget Sound and get to the outside waters. The other interesting thing about this result is that if we infer what the mortality rate must be from when smolts leave the inshore waters to when they return as adults and are detected, say if we do a calculation for interior Fraser Steelhead or Thompson River Steelhead. And we calculate how many adults we see coming back. The first time we get to estimate how many there are in the lower Fraser, um, that what that infers is that the mortality rate for the remaining about 29 months of life out off at sea is of the same magnitude as this. It just happens over 29 months instead of over 1 to 4 weeks. But we don't know whether it happens gradually over those 29 months or whether all of that mortality happens over a compressed period of time when they're returning inshore. But it's very comparable. Okay, so there's an intense amount of mortality in the short period of time going out, and there's a large amount of mortality distributed over an uncertain amount of time, but possibly during the time when they reapproach the inshore waters. Very comparable. Actually, it estimates out to be a little higher for the return component. Suggesting that if it is inshore, it could be the adult predation component that's accounting for that. In terms of offshore competition and ocean conditions, we know that steelhead depend on pelagic squids and pelagic epipelagic fishes. That's a main part of their diet when they're out at sea. But it's also the diet of many other species, except for maybe chums. They seem to have a different kind of composition, but all the other species are highly dependent on the squid. So there's evidence here of diet overlap in the offshore environment. These are the orange and the blue are some of the covariates that we used in the recruitment analysis that I showed earlier. The one point here is that if we look at total salmon abundance increasing over time, it's at a high level now in recent years. And if we look at ocean conditions measured as the PDO, it goes up and down because that's the pattern. But most recently here, I think for the first time, we have a combination of the two, that they're both high, meaning that a high PDO has a negative effect in southern BC and Puget Sound in terms of abundance and productivity, and has a positive effect for the northern part of the salmon range and around Western Alaska. And now we have a combination of high salmon density and unfavorable conditions in our area and in the Northwest. The gray is just the plot of the productivity of Thompson River, just in the background. But the point here is that the covariate models worked best with increasing salmon, did not work as well with just ocean conditions, but it's possible that the two are combining. This was described nicely in 2020 by Brendan Connors and others in their paper about sockeye salmon, where they show evidence of how a warm ocean and abundant salmon competitors combined strongly to reduce sockeye productivity in the north, and then in the south, that the negative effect was compounded in the south, basically. These are the data of total biomass of salmon in the North Pacific, published by Ruggiero and Irvine in 2018, reaching the highest abundances that we have record for. And in terms of biomass present in the North Pacific, most of that is in the form of chum salmon. And in terms of biomass, 40% originates from hatcheries recently. In terms of returning numbers, returning to the coastal areas, it's dominated by pink salmon, 25% of which originates from hatcheries now. And as we've observed for steelhead, we see declining body sizes across the species. On the question of whether fishing mortality has been sustainable for the Thompson, if we shift over, we forget the covariate models, and we just use we just look at productivity using a conventional stock recruit model, but with time varying productivity. Here we have productivity declining over time. And here is the exploitation rate in the orange on the right, and how it has trended over time. So productivity has declined, exploitation rate has trended over time. And if we simulate the sustainability of the population given the productivity combined with a density effects parameter, which is not shown, and with the exploitation rate that was being administered at the time, and we compare what the abundance of a simulation is at the end of a long time frame compared to at the beginning of the long time frame, we see that 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 the population could have sustained the exploitation rates that were being imparted for most of the time frame, but that only recently has it become unsustainable. Okay, so the idea here that the environment and fishing have combined to produce an unsustainable state, it's happened very recently. Incidentally, from about this period here on in the exploitation rate time series, this is all bycatch. And this part here at the very beginning is bycatch plus removals from targeted fishing. Okay, so by the brood year of the mid 80s, which corresponds to the 1989 fishing season for Thompson, catch and release was implemented, so that removed a component of exploitation that was in the form of sport harvest. So from about this period onward, this is just bycatch, okay, and ending with bycatch effects and colliding with low productivity, producing a state of unsustainability. If we add exploitation rate at MSY as a way of comparing or maybe gauging how precautionary we've been in the past, we weren't very precautionary at the beginning. We were more precautionary as time went on, and then productivity declined, whereby the mid 2000s brood year, so that's about the 2010 fishing year, that we're not so precautionary anymore. Short period of reprieve, courtesy of Mother Nature, and then proceeding on in say 2012, which corresponds to the 2016 fishing year, of being fishing in an unsustainable manner. And this decline in exploitation down to zero, this is not a reaction to the state of steelhead. This is the 2019 fishing season, where there was just no fishing opportunity because target salmon species became returned in too low of abundance. In 2020, there was more fishing opportunity. So if I were prepared to have put a point on, which I'm not quite yet, but that point will end up being up here somewhere. Okay, it won't be zero. The Chilcotin, similarly, productivity going down over time, exploitation rate going down over time. If we just jump to looking at how precautionary we've been basically playing a little more fast and loose with the Chilcotin in retrospect. Not very precautionary at the beginning. Some enhanced precaution, courtesy mostly of better productivity conditions. Not so much decline in exploitation, more that Mother Nature is offering up more precaution at this point, and then not a brief period of unprecautionary fishing, more precautionary here, and then but this would be so late 90s, that would be early 2000s, a period from the early 2000 fishing season to about the 2010 fishing season, where we weren't being precautionary, at least not with respect to Chilcotin, slight period of reprieve, and then falling off again. And in the Chilcotin, the period of the exploitation rate, which constitutes just bycatch, is from about this period onward. This is all bycatch. Oh, sorry. This is all bycatch, and this period is bycatch plus sport fishing mortality, basically. Okay. So that's looking back in time. If we dare look forward with one of the covariate models, for what it's worth, if pinniped equivalents continue to increase at the rate that they're increasing, and the rate of pinniped, the rate of change in Pinniped equivalents has been it appears to be stabilizing at around 1.6% per year. So if we continue that growth, and the increase is mostly not so much harbor seals, it's mostly in the form of sea lions. So if that continues and we conduct a simulation, that the Thompson seems to that would suggest that the Thompson would hang in there for a bit, but that eventually it would not persist. Well, it would decline to low abundance. It would still persist, which I'll explain later, but it will just decline to very, very low abundance, starting off at recent abundances of about a couple of hundred fish, hovering at around in the hundreds, and then going away. But it would take quite a long time. And Chilcotin, about the same thing, starting off at about 100 fish, which is what we're seeing now, and then slowly reaching super low abundances. Not unlike what we've seen in many South Coast winter run populations as well, like the Keo, for instance. Okay, I'm not going to give much time to discussing freshwater conditions because of the time constraint, but I do want to mention one thing here is that steelhead are not alone in producing smolts that go to sea and in persisting. They do have a reproductive relationship with rainbow trout that they spawn with. There is a constraint on how much rearing habitat there is available, and this is mainly an ecological constraint. As steelhead range penetrates into inland, the anadromous life history loses out to other life histories that are on balance more advantageous. But where they do exist, they exist with rainbow trout, and a lot of rainbow trout males will spawn with steelhead females. There's a strong inherited component in going to sea, and there are genes required for going to sea, which rainbow trout help to conserve. Okay, so there's a built-in system here of conserving genes for anadromy. However, ideally, it's better to have some steelhead contribute eggs into the freshwater environment, which is constrained, so that those traits that were successful in a changing ocean environment actually get passed on to at least some individuals that will then continue. So the steelhead will persist for a long time because of this system, probably at very low levels of abundance. The other thing, when we simulate a life history system like this, it helps us to see where the recovery potential rests. And basically, when we examine various management levers, and we vary survival rates at the various stages that would mimic or would represent various management levers, we see that all the potential for recovering the abundance of steelhead basically rests with levers associated with the smolt to adult survival rate. There is very little, the simulations suggest, and our experience also, I think, suggests that there is very little prospect for improving recovery by managing or improving survivals between egg to smolt. You can certainly help with persistence, improving survival in freshwater would help with persistence, but it just with the ecological constraints, with the fact that rainbows are helping to constantly fill up that freshwater habitat with offspring, that the ability to recover the population does not exist with freshwater factors. It all rests with the smolt to adult part of the life history. These results from the simulation exercises, a change in abundance in steelhead in the hundreds of % is really what's required. So for example, if you think of the Thompson of being down to 200 fish now, a 5-fold increase might be acceptable to some as a partial recovery, building back up to 1,000. But anything that's a double-digit % change is not a recovery, a lever. And that's so reducing steelhead fishing mortality to 0. It's not a very powerful lever now because there's other survival factors in the smolt to adult stage that make the fishing mortality lever weaker than it's ever been. Maximizing the fry to par survival in the habitat, if it were even possible, is very weak. Persecuting rainbows has a slight positive effect according to simulation, but very weak. And stocking fry, because of the habitat constraints, doesn't really amount, is very weak now. And stocking yearlings with residualism in play and with recent levels of hatchery fish survival that's disproportionately low from wild fish survival, for which we have measures for, it renders the hatchery options of being useless for recovery. So to quickly summarize, the strongest evidence at this time supports the hypothesis that inshore predation has caused most of the decline. There is some evidence supporting the hypothesis that competition in the ocean and ocean conditions have also contributed to decline. Steelhead cannot sustain fishing mortality at this time. If natural survival improves, its natural survival needs to improve slightly for fishing rates from 0 to recent levels to have the potential to dictate whether the populations go up and down. An improvement in survival between smolt and adult is needed for recovery. There is no, as I said, there is no prospect for recovery by improving egg to smolt. Steelhead using the best quality freshwater habitats will persist the best. Resident rainbow trout will continue to produce smolts and conserve genes associated with anadromy, and maximizing natural adaptation is very important at this time. I wanted to close with just a couple of questions that continue to rest with me, that we don't necessarily have to dwell on here, but I just want to close this way. I wonder what potential there is for stemming or reducing pinniped abundance by way of predation on the pinnipeds, and what are the robust policies around fishing, harvesting, salmon enhancement that should be considered. And that's it.
Great. That's a really fascinating talk. Thanks very much, Rob. I would like to open it up for questions. So Carl has a question. Go ahead, Carl.
Unmute.
Actually, it's just a comment beyond saying you did just as amazing a job as one would expect from that introduction, which didn't even really do you justice. You're a remarkable character. But you've worked with Josh Corman, eh?
Yeah.
Josh Corman's collected a bunch of data that very strongly support this idea that steelhead genes hang around in rainbow populations. He's done a lot of tagging of rainbow trout that were stocked down in the Grand Canyon in Arizona in the Colorado River. And within that population, it's been around as no anadromy at all. There's a mini anadromy that part of the population exhibits. They do a downstream migration from their main nursery areas down into the lower area of the river, and then mature and migrate back up into the spawning area. So the steelhead, and at the same size as when steelhead do their ocean migration. So this is remarkable business that the steelhead genes are still hiding even after many, many generations in just fresh water there.
There's a study that a really great study about this. It's represented in this slide here. If you're still seeing my slides, I don't know if you're still seeing my slides, but there's a paper in 2014 by that showed how the genes required for anadromy are conserved even beyond 100 years in places where dams have been put up, and they only really disappear in over sort of more geologic timeframes. And the other interesting finding was that they were conserved better if they had a reservoir to migrate down to. So if they could exercise a similar life history where they had to migrate down to some environment to become big, that helped conserve the anadromous genes.
It's Rick Hogan from Rupert. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We had a fish farm in Rupert many years ago. The province gave us a bunch of Gerard rainbow eggs, and we had a ewe fish for kids on the shore, and we had net pens. And we took the Gerards, and the ones that went to the ewe fish for the kids, they were around 12 inches, whatever. All the brothers and sisters of them that were in sea pens turned to steelhead, and we're all in the 30 to 35 pound class. Brothers and sisters, and we got 12 inches versus 30 pounds out of the same batch of eggs. And I'm just wondering, like you're talking about the switch over from rainbows to things, like the Gerards are the Upper Columbia, and they got dammed out so they couldn't get to sea. Eh? But obviously something triggered in them. And, you know, you're talking about this, and if you're worried about the fecundity for eggs, if you can take those rainbows and turn them into 30 pounders, you're going to get an awful lot of eggs back. And that might be a way to fix part of the problem. And then another thing on the sea lions that are in the Gulf of Georgia, the bulk of them are California lions, and they come up out of the south, and they're an invasive species. If they were a frog or a mussel or anything else, they would have been shot. But because they're sea lions, even though they're an invasive species, they've been just let to multiply. Like I've been fishing herring here for over 50 years, and it's ridiculous. They can't, the test boats can't even get out and make test sets because there's too many lions. It's just totally unnatural, and they're an invasive species, but nothing's being done. Thank you.
On the first part of your question, I'm not sure how that's a solution. Like, are you suggesting that we net pen the fish and then have them migrate back? I'm not sure how we would implement that.
No, but if you took the rainbow fry and, like, I don't know what triggers them to go to sea, and somehow you took them down to sea and they smolted and became steelhead instead of rainbow trout, wouldn't that give you a bunch of eggs? Couldn't that be a useful tool?
Oh, you would probably run the risk of producing rainbows. It's not guaranteed. If their growth rates are high, there's an environmental part to anadromy, and actually these steelhead live with that. So the way it works is that if it depends what sex they are. So if you're a small male steelhead and you're about 8 months of age and you're living in conditions that allows you to put on body fat, you won't smolt. If you're a female, you have to be that much fatter. It's very easy to produce residuals with growth rate. So I think anything like that would be totally experimental. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It seems a little, it would be experimental at best. I'd have to think about that.
It was just very interesting. Like, you know, here we got brothers and sisters that are the same batch of eggs, and we got 12 inches versus 30 pounds. Like,
well, I mean, even rainbow trout that we stock in lakes and virgin lakes that have never seen fish before, we can produce fish roughly of that class in the first few years. And then things change quickly. That's basically the story of stocking in and around Kamloops and other places. That those are the old fascinating stories of how we produced 20 pounders in the first few years that Virgin Lakes were stocked. So, and that's not even eating the kind of diet that you would find in the ocean. That's just eating macroinvertebrates in a lake. So, yeah, they certainly have the capacity to grow huge given the right conditions. There's no doubt about that.
Rob, I had a question about your covariate analysis. That was really extensive. And yeah, they looked at a lot of factors. I don't know if you want to go back to that slide. And it was all really intuitive. There was one covariate that was offshore maximum weight, which you classified as a competition sort of a factor, but the coefficient was positive there. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, salmon competition, the maximum weight. So that is that going against the hypothesis? Like you'd expect it to be negative, or is that just saying that maximum weight indicates good conditions for everybody?
Yes, I think that's the interpretation, that the covariate should be positive. The bigger the weight, the better the effect on the recruitment. That's right. Yes, I think that's how if I'm following correctly, I think that's to be expected. It should be positive. I would expect positive there, I think.
And so was that for sockeye pink, or which species were in that one?
For salmon competition and max weight, that is sockeye pink and chum combined. Oh, no, sorry. For max weight, it's just the covariate is simply max weight of steelhead as an index of the interaction between competition and offshore conditions. So the model above is simply sockeye pink and chum biomass. The second covariate, which represents competition and conditions combined, perhaps, or it could be just competition, is indexed by maxed weight. I've described it that way. And the third one here is just pink and sockeye biomass. I threw that in because of the diet composition information that I showed later, where chums may not be eating the same stuff, but that doesn't mean to say that chums aren't affecting what the food web in general. So just an alternative consideration.
And you did collinearity analysis to make sure that these variables weren't really heavily correlated, did you?
Because
it could be like max weight could be correlated negatively with sockeye pink and so on, biomass. So if you hadn't done, I'd expect if Josh was working with you on this, it should have been, but I would have been curious to see, let's say, the correlation between these, just correlation matrix between all these variables themselves.
I don't recall exploring that, but I will follow up on that. Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing is, if max weight was much larger in earlier years, then it's just maybe a correlate and not really necessarily, it may not have much weight in terms of causal sort of explanatory value.
Right. We were just treating it as an index of those hypothetical things, competition and offshore conditions. That's all.
Yeah,
just
okay.
interpreting it that way. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, thanks.
William?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Nice talk, Rob. I really appreciate it. And I also just really appreciate the sort of nuanced and depth that you brought to it. And in particular, I was interested in a couple of things. One, obviously, is the issue of pinnipeds and predation on large-bodied smolts. And I think, this work and the work coming out of Washington State really sort of, to me, indicates that steelhead recovery in the Salish Sea is not possible without ecosystem-based management to reduce predation rates. But I think also there's something that you talked about, and I'm hoping you might sort of be able to elaborate on it or tell me what data exists within the Fraser, is the sort of switching from anadromous to resident life histories. And of course, in oligotrophic systems like the gold and the Keo, those systems are much less productive for resident adults. And so there's a less of a sort of reservoir of residents to sustain steelhead populations through periods of low marine survival. But in the Thompson and the Chilcotin, I mean, those are very productive freshwater systems. And I wonder whether you have data or anecdotes about the sort of switching between residency and anadromy in portions of those basins, and whether there's an opportunity to sort of reconstruct a time series of the contribution of resident versus anadromous fish.
Well, ideally, we would like to have a good steady time series of the rainbow trout abundance that went along with the steelhead abundance. Unfortunately, we don't quite have that. We have the rainbow trout abundance estimates are much more sparse. But to give you an example, in the one of the tributaries of the Thompson, the Deadman River, just to give you an example, last year the steelhead escapement estimate was 21, and the rainbow trout escapement was 2,900 and something.
Right.
Right. The other thing that kind of relates to your question is evidence around the switching. Here are some data from in 2006, when there was a modest number of steelhead producing par. In the juvenile population, about 80% of the par came from the mothers and 20% came from the steelhead mothers, and 20% came from the rainbow mothers. A few years later, when the steelhead abundance was really low, we see a shift where half of the juveniles was 50-50. There's a bit of a shift. And then when we sampled the adults, in a year where steelhead abundance was low, we see sizable contributions from the residents to produce steelhead. We see so here are the female steelhead males, half coming from steelhead mothers, half coming from resident mothers. Same with the males, about 50-50, and a real a lack of a linkage between steelhead females producing resident females. So I think this relates a little bit to your question. There is also certainly steelhead females produce resident males, but as you know, sneak spawning in this species of Pacific salmon manifests itself mostly through the production of resident males as opposed to jack males. So that's I think why that's there, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of, I don't think I'm answering your question completely, but that's what I have available right to me. I'd love to talk more about it, but that's what I have of top of mind, at least right now.
Thanks so much, Rob. That's actually really helpful. I'd missed this slide about the resident contribution and the steelhead contribution to PAR recruitment. So I think that sort of answered my question. Thanks so much.
Well, I didn't show this, Will.
Oh, okay.
I've got these stored below.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Are there some additional questions? Rob, I just want to about let's say your collaboration or correspondence with let's say Washington State biologists who are finding the same things, and if there's concern for wild steelhead down there as well, like it seems like there's a sort of growing consensus that you've kind of pinpointed the problem, and unless that problem is addressed, things don't look good. So in terms of biologists and managers, is there some let's say discussion towards trying to address the problem in a progressive way on both sides of the border? Like, are they ahead of us? Like, it seems like in the Columbia system they are.
Yeah. Not yet, I don't think. I think the answer to that question is not quite yet, but we usually convene once every couple of years. We're going to be convening next month by video conference for the first time, unfortunately. But we do have better representation from higher levels of the bureaucracy planning to attend. So hopefully that'll lead towards at least some discussion about thinking about the problem on a broader spatial scale.
You're, I guess, in the provincial government, whereas it would appear that the, let's say, ministries where you need collaboration, that's DFO, federal, and some of them have seen a lot of reluctance to hear this issue and to do anything about it, and they don't seem to want to know, and they don't want to. They don't know, and they don't want to know. They're doing relatively little. So to what extent are you, let's say, speaking with DFO people on these issues?
Well, my role has kind of evolved more toward the technical realm, and now we're interfacing. Now we're interfacing more with DFO at sort of bureaucratic levels that are higher than mine, which I think is kind of useful. Directors and managers are talking more about this issue as opposed to biologists convening with other biologists, directors on the other side. So I think it's the issue is obviously been hugely elevated within the province. It's I'm told it's a priority in the Premier's office. So at least it has been. Yeah. There's always been reluctance on the steelhead issue on the part of the department, just because of how hampered they are with the fishing system that's in place. The fact that most of the wild salmon harvest has to come from relatively non-selective methods. So that as long as we remain there, it's a very difficult problem for the department. That's sort of why that's sort of what my second question is about. And the paper by Schindler and Hailborn in 2015, talking about policy and talking about changing environment and talking about ideas like removing administrative barriers to being more flexible about how you extract biomass from the ecosystem, seems like very progressive ideas that I think would that I'm certainly interested in, even though I don't strictly work in the policy realm. So yeah. I think it's, my personal opinion is that and I think it's obvious with how salmon populations are trending, transforming to something that is much more selective would probably be in the industry's best interest too, or let's call them fishers in general. It would probably, and it's probably overdue. And I think, there's, I think the industry is suffering consequences and by way of opportunity because of the lack of flexibility.
It's Rick Hogan from Rupert here again. I don't know, like the Thompson and that, like how many repeat spawners you got. Like on the north coast here, the Skeena is close to 10% repeat spawners. And if you've got 68% mortality to the pinnipeds on the smolts going out, the steelhead coming back out, the repeat spawners, they're very weak when they hit the ocean. So they must be just about non-existent getting through the pinnipeds.
Yeah, they were all repeat spawning's always been low in the interior Fraser populations, and Thompson in particular, and they're lower now than they've ever been. Like there's almost no repeat spawners now.
Yeah, well, if they're getting that much of the smolts going out, they must be getting just about every one of the other ones. And I don't know the balance of the spawning and the cycle and what steelhead do. I don't know how that affects them, because on the north coast here, I've tagged steelhead over about a 20-year period personally with the Rupert vessel owners. And, you know, we've got repeat spawners. I don't know how many times they can do it, but I've had fish tagged, and 5 years later, someone returns the tag in from one of the tribs up in the upper Skeena. Now, in that 5-year period from when I put the tag on, I don't know how many times they repeat spawn. Do they come in every year after their first spawn? Do they come in every second or third? Or it's a big unknown.
Yeah, the pattern for us has been more like they'll come back after 2 years. Back when we had them, and we could kind of tell what was going on. But even in our case too, like the majority of the females will survive and migrate downstream. A modest proportion of the males will do so. The males will. It's a lot harder on the males, but they just don't come back. Like, so the Kelp migration is substantial, typically, even now. They've come back in fewer and fewer numbers over time.
Thank you.
Are there some additional questions or comments?
Yes, it's Joy Thorkelson here. I of course, have listened to Bob several times, and I thank him when he is publicly going out and presenting this information on, particularly on pinnipeds. I have two comments. One, if what the number of spawners that need to, particularly on the Thompson, the number of spawners needed to create maximum sustained yield. If the number of par remain the same regardless of the number of spawners, then I'm wondering if the number of spawners that is at MSY is having a look at the issue of par restrictions, so that if you're only putting out 200, or if you're only putting out X number of par, regardless of the number of spawners are coming in, then shouldn't that be taken into account as what MSY is? And that's my first question. The second question is, well, it's more of a statement. I don't believe at all that in your harvest rate or exploitation rate, both either your harvest rate or your exploitation rates for the impact of the commercial fleet. You have very high exploitation rates for example, in the Fraser gillnet fishery. If you're looking at just the commercial, regular commercial fishery, it only fishes in a normal year for 2 days. And I find it hard that there is any kind of a impact for 2 days. It's the same as a Johnson Straits fishery. The amount of fish that would have to be taken as a percentage just does not translate. And, you know, someday we're going to have a discussion about that because that is, nobody believes your model numbers, and nobody knows actually, nobody has actually had a chance from the commercial fleet to examine your model. It may be that.
So based on what, Joy? What are you confronting the outputs of the model, which was a long-standing collaboration between DFO scientists and ourselves? Like, based on what you contested? mean, the one thing that's misleading when you think about fishing over a 2-day period is that you fail to tell people that it's a 2-day period in an area that's 70 kilometers long that contains a large proportion of the run, or that's 100 and something kilometers long in Johnson Straits. It's very misleading to try to characterize the impact of a fishery just by its duration.
And how many boats are participating in that fishery?
Hundreds of boats.
No,
hundreds of boats.
But Bob, that's why we need to have a discussion. It can't take place now over the air, but I can tell you that whatever model you have, if you're using a consistent exploitation rate from the 1990s through to 2000 and to 2020, your model is exceedingly flawed. Last year in Johnson Straits, on a normal Johnson Strait year in the 1990s, we would have been fishing far more often, and we would have been fishing with a much larger fleet. Last year, I think the fleet maxed out probably at 40 boats in Johnson Straits. And in the last number of years, that's where the fleet has been at. In fact, the largest fleet was in 2014 in Johnson Straits, and 2018 in Johnson Straits, and that in 2018 there were 65 boats. If you look at 2014, there were probably maybe a handful more, but I don't think the South Coast has seen over 100 boats, seine boats fishing, and the same with the gill netters. So the fleet was cut by 50%, and as time has gone on, the fleet number of licenses has remained the same, but the amount of boats that have been fishing is now.
Joy, hang on a second. His time trend shows just the pattern you're describing. He's not assuming that there's a high mortality in every year. He shows quite a significant drop in bycatch mortality.
That's correct, except
because they are using those numbers in doing the bycatch calculation. Maybe incorrectly, but they're using them, certainly using them, and they're seeing the effects you're talking about.
Carl, what the difference is that it shows in the if you want to put that slide up, Bob, that it shows a consistent or increased exploitation rate.
I'll put the Thompson up. I'll put the MSY up too. So what part are you talking about, Joy?
I'm talking about you have a 3 charts: fishing mortality, or three.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, yeah. The orange line is the exploitation is the total fishing mortality rate from all sources estimated.
Okay, that's not this one I'm looking at. I'm looking at productivity.
Okay, so productivity is on the left.
No, that's the only chart I can see. Is everybody else seeing what?
You're not seeing the orange chart, Joy?
No.
The orange one on the right.
Maybe my view is wrong or something.
Yeah, because it shows a very definitely much lower value in recent years, and then nothing at all in the last couple of years.
So just a couple of points.
Just like you say it should.
Yeah, a couple of points based on what Joy has just said.
I can see now. Okay, so what's happening is showing in 2000 the mortality rate is showing from the year 19, say just late 90s, which just after the Mifflin plan, and it's showing annual mortality rate that's been increasing. And I would suggest to you that the annual mortality rate has actually decreased from 19.
Absolutely not. I know exactly what happened to cause that increase, and basically DFO imposed a lessening of conservation, mainly with the resumption of chum fishing when they were otherwise out of the water. So instead of waiting until November to go fishing, they just unilaterally imposed that they were going to go in late October. That was that accounted for that increase at that time. It actually, as steelhead were going down, they made a decision at some point on their own that they were going to reintroduce chum fishing in October when it was absent from October for a period of time. So fishing mortality started stemming upward again, but not much, just a little bit, as this chart shows. The other couple other points. if you say that, let's say the whole orange line is not as high on the graph as you say it is, well, that means the steelhead productivity has been even less than we've estimated, and it's even lower now than we think it is.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest is happening, because both the gillnet fleet and the seine fleet are using selective techniques that are different certainly now than they were in the 1990s. And so as the 2000, and I would have expected to see a decline in steelhead mortality, not an increase in steelhead mortality. And the number of days fishing has been so low that I would but I'm going to take a look at that and see if what you're saying is that the timing has changed.
Okay,
They're also including the FN gillnet stuff there that's going on over a long stretch of river.
Yeah.
And
Yes, well,
and I'd like to,
that's just nasty business, Joy.
Yeah.
You don't want to go there.
I'd like to mention one more thing though, that when you do the stock recruit analysis, what you get an appreciation for is the strengths and weaknesses of the data when you're dealing with a particular species. And the strength in the steelhead data, say compared to the salmon data, is that we have excellent spawner data and we have relatively uncertain fishing mortality data. It's different for other species. But when we do the analysis from the stock recruitment point of view, what we find is that even if we're uncertain, even like in these years here, where like maybe fishing mortality is down at the 20% level, all fishery effects included, that when you do the stock recruit analysis, if you're a little bit uncertain about that component of the reconstruction, it's actually not that big a deal. Most of the information about the recruitment abundance is actually in the very good spawner escapement estimates on the following generation. So there's no great need to worry too much about where the elevation of this line is, right? It's not as critical as you make it sound.
Well, it's critical for the commercial fleet.
Well, I mean, who cares? I mean, the productivity is like, it's unsustainable now. I mean, exactly how unsustainable is it? I mean, it's like we're down below 1 recruits per spawner. You know, what fraction of
so any
one
catch is unsustainable?
Well, sure, yeah. I don't think it matters.
Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody, for participating. Thanks so much, Rob, for giving this talk. It's just a really fantastic, fascinating talk. Great to have you here in our quantitative seminar.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's really nice to have you presenting this material.